In the year 885 AD, Paris still believed that walls and a river meant safety. But across the water, something was taking shape that looked nothing like a traditional raid. This wasn't just a Viking attack. This was an enemy that came from places they shouldn't have. From beneath the water, from the fog, from silence. In this video, we'll see how a city was forced to face an enemy that wasn't rushed, wasn't afraid, and never relied on a simple plan. This is the story of the first strike. The first mistake. And the moment Paris realized this siege would not end like the others. What you're about to see is only the beginning. Year 845 AD. Francia still called itself an empire, but beneath that claim, everything was cracking. A young and inexperienced king, lords who each behaved like their own law, and a city whose people trusted prayers far more than swords. Paris had not yet become the grand stone fortress of the later Middle Ages. It was little more than a wooden stronghold sitting on a small island in the Seine. A city which, despite its limitations, meant one thing above all to the northerners: the vault of a crumbling empire. At dawn that day, the guards on the city's wooden towers saw something strange. No enemy, no smoke, no banner, just a small change in the river's behavior. The Seine was always calm, but today the water seemed heavier. The waves looked different. On their own, these signs meant nothing to the old guards, until an unusual sound rose from the fog. A sound that was not an animal, nor the wind, nor any ship they knew. A dry, rhythmic, relentless sound. The sound of oars, but not one. Dozens, hundreds. Gradually, a dark line appeared on the water. At first, they thought it was a group of Scandinavian merchants, but as it drew closer, its true form emerged. A long formation of narrow, elongated ships, so many that the water beneath them was churning. Ships whose prows were carved into open-mouthed wooden dragon heads. In Paris, the bells rang. Soldiers jolted awake. Nuns began to pray. And everyone understood one thing. This was no trade caravan. This was the arrival of an army that had terrified Europe for decades. Within that endless formation stood a man who would become legend. A leader sworn upon in Scandinavia. A man with a long beard, ice-cold eyes, and an intelligence many later said was deadlier than his sword. Ragnar Lodbrok. To Ragnar, Paris was not just a city to be taken. He knew Francia was collapsing from within. He knew the young king lacked experience. He knew the lords would not spend their own wealth to defend the city. And most importantly, he knew Paris was famous throughout Europe as the treasure vault of the Franks. When the first ships reached the walls, Parisians saw the true scale of the threat. This wasn't a raiding party. This was a fleet, hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors, men in leather armor with heavy wooden shields, and axes that reflected the sunlight like blades of ice. No shouts were exchanged. No arrows or stones were fired. The Vikings positioned their ships in silence, with an eerie precision, in front of the city. The soldiers of Paris still didn't know whether an attack or a negotiation was coming, but Ragnar had crafted that silence deliberately. A silence that wrapped around the city like a tightening rope. Up to this moment, not a single axe had been raised, but Paris already felt that its hardest days had officially begun. When the Viking fleet anchored before Paris, the city's commanders still hoped they could scare the invaders off with a few warning arrows and a show of strength. But there was one problem. Ragnar wasn't a man who feared warnings. He always made the first move in silence, not with a sword. Inside Paris, the commander of the fortress, a seasoned but deeply anxious man, tried to line up his forces along the walls. He sent soldiers up the wooden towers, placed the archers farther back, and told the young recruits, many seeing a real enemy for the first time in their lives, not to think. Just be ready. But being ready is one thing. Facing Ragnar is another. Across the river, Ragnar stood on the deck of his ship. The morning mist still hadn't fully lifted. He was killing time. Not out of confusion, out of calculation. The sign behaved strangely that season. Calm in the morning, but rising at midday. And Paris's defenses, built on a small island, were always more vulnerable at high tide. Ragnar knew this, and it was the kind of knowledge the Franks could never predict. His first move wasn't scaling the walls, wasn't fire, wasn't axes. It was something far stranger. He sent a group of his warriors toward the city, under a white flag. Paris froze. A white flag? Negotiation? Vikings? People? Priests? Even some commanders thought maybe this was just intimidation. A demand for tribute. But Ragnar didn't need negotiations to take tribute. He had burned half of Europe without asking for permission. So why a white flag? This is where Ragnar's design slowly begins to show. He requested permission for a small group of travelers to enter the city to buy food and water. A simple excuse, almost laughable. But inside Paris, fear worked faster than reason. If they refused, Ragnar might attack immediately. If they accepted, maybe bloodshed could be avoided. The commander eventually allowed 3 small boats to approach. It was a mistake that Frankish chroniclers would write about for centuries. As the boats drew closer, the Franks watched carefully. The Vikings carried weapons, hidden under heavy cloth. They looked harmless, but their eyes said otherwise. They weren't here to negotiate. And Ragnar didn't leave his flagship. He only watched from afar, waiting for the exact moment. The moment Paris believed he didn't plan to attack. Meanwhile, those 3 small boats were not the plan. They were only the curtain. The real plan was unfolding where Paris wasn't looking. Viking units were already landing further down the river, silently slipping into the marshlands behind the fortress. Ragnar was doing something the Franks could hardly imagine, using the river as a tactical shield to force Paris to stare at the front, while the real threat crawled behind them. For 30 years, the Vikings had burned Europe, but the attack on Paris wasn't just another raid. This time, Ragnar wanted something that generations would talk about, taking the political heart of the Franks with strategy, not just brutality. The sun climbed, the tide rose. Paris still believed this was a negotiation, and Ragnar stood in silence, waiting for the perfect moment, the moment that would change everything. The sign was calm, but not with its usual calmness. The people of Paris were still speaking with Ragnar's own voice, meaningless words, full of politeness, full of doubt. But across the water, where the mist still floated thin and pale, an unnatural silence pulsed. Only one man could hear that silence: the commander of Paris. He walked along the wall, placing his hand on the stone edge every few steps, as if to reassure himself that the city was still under his control. But the more he looked, the more he felt something was wrong. It was as if the river was waiting for a scream, for an event. At that moment, one of the guards shouted from the top of the tower. Something moved on the far side of the river. At first, no one took it seriously. Maybe wind shadows, maybe a bird, maybe a wave. But the shadows grew, one by one. Then, through the thin morning haze, a cluster of light Viking boats appeared. Boats that had not been seen all morning, as if they had risen from the river itself. These boats moved silently. No war cry, no drumbeat, only the soft sound of oars sinking into the water and rising again. The Parisians were confused. If this was an attack, why no shouting? If this was a raid, Why no speed? Ragnar only wanted to plant one thing into the enemy's mind. You have no idea what is happening. That was his sharpest weapon. When the boats came within a few meters of the island's walls, the Frankish archers climbed up. The order was clear. The moment you see hostile movement, shoot. But before any of them could even steady their breath, something happened that would be recorded in history for generations. As one of the approaching boats drifted forward, it dropped a thick rope into the water, so heavy that 2 men had to shove it overboard. The rope sank, and seconds later, the river's surface boiled. A swarm of warriors erupted from beneath the water, soaked, muddy, armed with axes and shields. They had not come from the front, not from the rear, from below. Paris had never seen anything like it. Shouts rang out. The archers panicked. They didn't know whether to aim at the boats or at the mud-covered creatures rising from the river like marsh beasts. This was the exact moment Ragnar had been waiting for. 30 seconds of absolute chaos. And in war, 30 seconds is a lifetime. A heartbeat later, the deep thud of drums echoed from Ragnar's flagship. Finally, the war cries erupted. Ragged, heavy, metallic, the entire fleet that had spent the morning in silence now roared as one. From above, the Parisians saw a sight that defied reason. A wave of Vikings climbing out from under the river, light boats approaching from the front, and the main fleet advancing from afar. 3 fronts, 3 directions, and 1 city with a single wall. The first arrow was fired, then the second, but instead of pushing the Vikings back, the arrows accomplished exactly what Ragnar wanted. They signaled that Paris had officially entered the war. The white flag fell into the water and drifted away with the current. Within minutes, the first blood darkened the sign. The first warrior dropped. The first Frankish soldier fell. First body floated. The river that had been calm and blue took on a new color. Ragnar had opened the first breach, a breach that would grow and grow until Paris could no longer close it. As the Vikings rose from the river like shadows, the echo of their war drums still trembled in the air. But inside the city, something else was trembling. The church drums. The bells rang over and over, something like a public command. Anyone could understand the meaning. Paris is officially under siege. The Parisian commander, who minutes earlier had been worried only about a few slow boats, was now facing a reality he had no map for. But he wasn't the kind of man who surrendered early. This city wasn't just timber and stone to him. It was his legacy. He looked out from the wall again, this time without hesitation, and he saw something that instantly changed his thinking. The Vikings crawling out of the water were soaked, heavy, weighed down, their armor full of river water, their steps slow. For a moment, just a moment, they were vulnerable. This was the golden moment every real commander knows to spot. He shouted, "Archers, aim only for the men coming out of the water. They're not ready yet." The archers, confused until now, suddenly had a clear target. A rain of arrows began from the top of the walls. Arrows sinking, arrows sliding off shields, arrows thudding into wet armor with muffled impact. Many Vikings had no shields. They couldn't carry them underwater, so several fell within the first few seconds. Ragnar noticed this from afar, not with fear, but with a strange satisfaction. That thin, familiar smile, because this was exactly what he wanted. Paris had reacted. Paris had revealed itself. Paris had shown the strength of its walls. To Paris, this looked like a counterattack. In truth, they were stepping exactly where Ragnar wanted them on his map. The Parisian commander, seeing Viking bodies on the riverbank, felt a surge of hope. For the first time, real hope, he shouted to his men. They're not invincible. Once they're out of the water, they die like everyone else. The sentence struck like a spark, the kind that rekindles morale. The guards stood firmer. Archers aimed sharper. Even the civilians gathered behind the gates felt, for the first time, that maybe Paris wouldn't fall today. But then the truth revealed itself. The soaked Vikings, despite the arrows and the wounds, once they stood fully upright, once they received their shields from the boats, once their formation tightened, something changed in them, as if their spirits had just returned to their bodies. Strong, unified, numb to the pain they had taken seconds earlier. At first the Parisians thought they might retreat, but no. In a perfectly coordinated motion, the Vikings advanced, a single line, a human wall. Arrows clattered against their wooden shields, but this time no one fell. The Parisian commander began shouting again. "Shoot heavier! Brace yourselves! They're getting closer!" But it was already too late. Among the Vikings, a man with sand-colored beard stepped ahead of the rest, the one who, in every battle, always struck the first blow. A breaker of lines, and he was the first to swing his axe and crash it into the side gate's wooden frame. The sound of that strike was enough for all of Paris to understand. This was only the beginning. Paris had counterattacked, but now it was time for the Vikings to answer. And the walls were just beginning to remember what their purpose truly was. The sound of the axe smashing into the gate was still echoing through the air of Paris. Splinters of wood, like broken bones, were tearing away from the frame, and each new strike pushed the city one step closer to collapse. Behind the wall, Frankish soldiers held up their shields with trembling hands, while from the other side only the raw, northern force came, a power that seemed forged from both ice and fire. When the fourth strike landed, the ground beneath the defenders trembled. The fifth blow bent the hinges. But before the sixth could finish the job, a sudden sound rose from deep within the city, a sound that carried more weight than an axe, more force than any battle cry. The bell, the great bell of Paris, the one that was only rung when the entire city hung between life and death. Hearing that sound made the Vikings pause. The strike stopped, and for the first time, the air of battle cracked open. Moments later, a rider appeared from the top of the southern steps, a messenger holding a small white flag. The Franks had not retreated, they had not collapsed, but they understood that if the gate fell today, tomorrow, there would be nothing left to defend. Negotiation, not a Viking victory, not a Frankish defeat, but both sides knew that continuing the fight would only spill more blood. On the shore, Ragnar, his face wet with battle and exhaustion, looked for a moment at the half-broken gate. He could have ordered the attack, he could have ended Paris that very day, but he made another decision, one that people later realized was far more dangerous than breaking the gate. He accepted the heavy tribute, mounted his horse, and the waters of the Seine once again rose under the weight of the northern fleet. Paris exhaled. The people thought they had won. The soldiers thought this would be the last time an axe struck their walls, but no one knew that this silence was the silence of a wolf simply licking its wounds. Years passed. They thought the nightmare was over. They thought the Vikings had been buried in the year 845. But in a frozen winter, when the river was so cold it gave off no breath, the sky darkened again. This time not 120 ships, not one tribe, not one commander. This time an army came that looked as if the entire north had decided to take revenge at once. And the event Paris believed would never repeat, returned with 10 times the force. The Great Siege of Paris, 885 to 886. A story that now begins, real, raw, and terrified.